Hello, my name's Seb Coxon. I'm in the Department of German at UCL, and welcome to my taster, Introduction to German Literature. I'm going to look at a couple of things with you over the next 10 minutes, but before I do that, I just wanted to draw attention to we've got a new Introduction to German Literature course starting next year, 2022 to 23. And as you can see, we are trying to do a couple of very ambitious things here. We're very excited about it. So in term one, we're going to be looking at short narrative literature. In term two, we're going to be looking at drama and poetry. And we are going to take the audacious step of not just looking at famous modern stuff, but also integrating some older stuff too, to give you experience and hone your skills with literary analysis with reference to literature in the making, the medieval stuff, to sophisticated modern literature too. I'm going to start, I think, why don't we start with Kafka? Kafka is always a good place to start and see where that takes us. So Kafka, the text we look at in this course is Das Urteil, the Judgment, which was written in 1912, allegedly written in one night, but was only published in 1916. Now, Kafka is a relatively famous author, of course. He's famously unhappy, famously failed to get married on several occasions, and famously had a very fraught relationship with his father, which some people like to see reflected in this tale, Das Urteil, the Judgment, which is actually quite a short thing. It's essentially the story of an argument which kind of almost takes us by surprise between the main character, Georg Bendermann, and his elderly father. The remarkable thing about this argument is the way it begins and the way it ends. It begins in a kind of a bizarre dispute about whether Georg's friend, to whom he's just written a letter, who lives in St. Petersburg in Russia, actually exists or not. And it culminates in a damning judgment on the part of the father, who declares that his son was an innocent child, but a devilish person, and then condemns him to death by drowning, which is really quite shocking. So when looking at a text like this, as I said, it's a relatively short thing. We kind of start with some very basic stuff, and then we try and build up our analyses, in a way that's probably familiar to you from the way you've been looking at literature, either in English A level or perhaps in your German or other modern languages A levels at school. So if we start with content, as I said before, this is basically a very straightforward story. It starts off, in fact, with Georg having penned this letter to his friend, in which he tells his friend that he's recently got engaged, sort of getting lost in thought. And that's actually quite a key point. He then goes with his letter in his pocket to see his father. They have this argument, and it ends in Georg's death, which is really quite shocking and surprising. Now, if we then think a bit about the structure of this story, I mean, the content is bizarre, and we wouldn't really expect anything else from Kafka. The content is bizarre. What we can cling on to, though, is actually it has a very neat structure, which, if you like, kind of contains the bizarre content. So on the one hand, we have really, the story comes full circle. At the start, when Georg is mulling over his relationship with his friend and he's lost in thought, he's sitting at his desk, looking out of a window, gazing down onto a river. By the end of the story, then we find Georg charging out of his father's room, flying down the stairs, absolutely terrifying the cleaner who's coming up the stairs, rushing out to a bridge from which he hangs, waiting for some loud traffic to pass before he lets himself drop into the water. So actually, structurally, the story comes full circle. Georg starts by looking at the river and ends up drowning in it. The second point to note about the structure, or another structural observation, and this really lies at the heart of Das Urteil, is the narrative perspective, which again is typically complex and typically Kafkaesque. The key to the narrative perspective is essentially that before we know where we are when reading this story, we are inside Georg's head. And actually, almost everything from almost everything that we learn about what's going on in the story is kind of refracted through Georg's perspective. That means that we don't actually have much, increasingly, we don't have much objective basis on which to judge very much. We don't know quite whether Georg's impressions are true or not. We're in his head, and we only leave his head right at the end when he falls into the river. And we have the very last line, which I've got quoted here, the very last line of the story. In diesem Augenblick ging über die Brücke ein geradezu unendlicher Verkehr. At this moment, there flowed of the bridge an absolutely unending stream of traffic. We're outside of Georg now, and Georg's own story, his life has come to an end, his story has come to an end, which we were so immersed in, and suddenly we're outside of it, and we have a kind of image of complete and utter indifference. You could say it's a kind of quintessentially modern image. Traffic, the system carries on, social life carries on, and nobody's really any the wiser. Nobody's really taken any notice of Georg, although while we were in his head, everything that was happening seemed so terribly important. Now, this narrative perspective has an impact on has a real effect on how we deal with the themes of the story. So a lot of the literature we tend to choose to study is literature which is overtly thematic, which wants to say things, which wants to address things, or at the very least prompt its readership, or with older literature, its audience to actually think about stuff which is relevant to them. Now, the trouble we have with Kafka, and this is a direct consequence of the narrative perspective, is that we're always on unsure ground. When you start to say, well, what are the themes of Das Urteil? We can say on the one hand, we've kind of got a collapse of psychology, this drive to kill himself at the end or to carry out his father's judgment of execution. You could say is the result of a psychological meltdown on the part of Georg, and that actually could be, and some critics say this, that could be the main theme of Das Urteil. As a crisis of modern consciousness acted out in this kind of private family drama between these two individuals. If we work with that and we start thinking about each of the main characters in the story, which is Georg, the son, and his father, we're left wondering. We don't really have much certainty. So if we take the son, for example, the son Georg is a really odd combination of, on the one hand, what would appear to be success. So his business is doing well in his father's retirement. We learn that 3 years previously, the mother died, the father's got older, he's got weaker, he's taking a backseat in the business, and the business is going very, very well. Georg's also become engaged. He has every reason to be happy. And yet he seems extremely insecure, so insecure that he still needs his father's confirmation or support or approval to send this letter. I'm thinking that's a little bit odd. So we've got sort of insecurity and success. And being party to Georg's thoughts, we also become aware, but we get involved in these quite protracted thought processes about his relationships with others. So his relationship with his friend, his relationship with his fiancée, and then, of course, and majorly, his relationship with his father. But because we're inside his head, we never really know whether this is objectively verifiable or not. It's from his perspective. Similarly with the father, because we see everything from Georg's perspective, and the other bits of information we learn come in the speech of the father, we've absolutely no idea whether the father is stark raving mad, whether the father's accusations against Georg are correct and legitimate, or what in fact is going on. So the father makes actually acts out almost a comedy, is like a tragicomedy, in pretending to, deliberately exaggerating his own weakness, encouraging Georg to put him to bed. And we have that, there's a very famous sequence in Das Urteil where the father asks his son repeatedly whether he is covered up. Bin ich gut zugedeckt? Almost lulling Georg into a false sense of security. Georg takes the bait, starts fantasizing almost about how he can completely take control of everything, how he should be looking after his father. Only for his father sort of to throw back the covers, stand up on the bed, and appear to dominate his son, shattering him completely. In fact, claiming that the friend in Russia is his own friend and not Georg's friend. Not only that, that the friend in Russia is the son he always wanted. So systematically, psychologically demolishing Georg. So one of the things you could say to emerge, if we think about from the characters, we start looking at the characters, is power, and power in relationships. Now, when we start thinking about how we might want to relate Das Urteil to other works of literature, before we come to the question, of course, of Kafka's own private life, Kafka is really one of those authors where we tend to view his work through the prism of his life and through the prism of all sorts of other things that he wrote. You know, Kafka wrote lots of letters in which he also talks about things like Das Urteil. Before we come back to that, and I do want to come back to that, one observation we could make about Das Urteil is that, in fact, it is a modern take on quite an old theme, or quite an old phenomenon, cultural phenomenon, the archetypal conflict between father and son, power and rivalry between the generations. As one declines, then the other one grows and asserts itself more. Now, in that context, I mean, we can look at all sorts of other works from German literature, world literature. If we wanted to do that, we could go as far back as the 9th century, like a great old German thing called the Lay of Hildebrand, or the Hildebrandslied. But let's be a little bit more moderate and only go back to the Middle Ages, to another text, Die halbe Decke, half a blanket, which is also on our new first year course, which survives in various versions from about the end, the last quarter of the 13th century. This text too is about a father-son conflict. This text too is about what goes on within a family after the death of the elderly mother. And this text too stresses, in fact, that this is potentially a huge problem, although of course it does it from a quintessentially medieval point of view, and it introduces a third generation. So I don't know whether you can see at the bottom here, we've got a picture, we've got the old father in bed, but we actually have, this is his grandson. So this is the son there, the little curiously naked figure, the little boy with the bow and the arrow. This is his grandson. And this third generation, the figure of the third generation in the medieval text, is actually very important. So half a blanket is about what happens when the elderly father decides his wife has died, that he's going to hand over everything he owns, the power of his household, all of his money, to his son, who has got married and who has a young child. It's his son's turn to look after him. It's his son's turn to run everything. The unfortunate consequence of this is, though, his son neglects his father. Again, that is a kind of a refrain that we've got that in Das Urteil too. Although there we have Georg of his own accord feeling slightly guilty about it when he sees the state of his father's clothing, the state of his room, how dark it is. Although there it's also tinged with power play. Here, the son neglects his father, couldn't care less about him. In fact, the father ends up kind of lodging in the freezing cold beneath the stairs, near the kitchens, pretty much outdoors. And the only friend that the old father has is his grandson, this young boy. Things come to a head one terrible winter. The old father is absolutely freezing cold. And he sends his grandson to ask his son for a blanket, the old horse blanket that there's been for decades in the stable. And the little boy goes off and does that. The father cuts the blanket in two, gives the little boy half a blanket, hence the title of the story, for the old man. The heart of this story lies on the way that the text plays on its, and this time we can talk at 13th century, we talk about the audience rather than the readership, plays on its audience's emotions. So when the little boy hands over half a blanket to the old man, we have this incredibly kind of emotive moment. You could say it's pathetic, the pathetic joy of the old man who used to own so much and is now reduced to begging for half a blanket. This quotation, begunde vor Freuden weinen, die Augen ihm überfielen, dass ihm die Tränen fielen, zu Tal über den grauen Bart. He began to weep with joy, his eyes brimmed over and the tears streamed down over his grey beard. It's interesting, the motif of the beard here, beard to do with masculinity, authority, patriarchy, but here in this context, it's also to do with mortality, the grey beard, this man is old. Now the young boy is just as the audience is meant to be quite taken by this, the young boy too is taken by this and goes back to see his father. And the father says, well, what do you want now? And the young boy says, well, can I have the other half of the blanket? And the father says, well, yeah, but what for? And the young boy says, well, I want to keep it so that when you too are old, I can give it to you. When you too are in grandpa's position, I will treat you just the same. That is a kind of eureka moment for the son, who suddenly realizes through the innocent wisdom of his child how absolutely appallingly he's treated his father, has a complete volte-face, completely changes the way he views things, brings his father literally in from the cold, bathes him, washes his hair, clothes him, gives him fine clothing and gives him good food and looks after him for the rest of his life. The moral of the tale, and I said this is a moral tale, the moral of the tale is look after your parents in the way that you would want your children to look after you. Now, this is a very medieval story. It's very, very different to Das Urteil. And yet, there are some striking similarities. And you could say, in fact, we have got a kind of, with this comparison, if we were to compare these two texts, we've kind of got a quintessentially modern take on something and a quintessentially medieval take. And on the face of it, at least with the medieval take, we've got this conflict between the generations, the archetypal conflict between father and son is dealt with through the framework of morality, or more obviously Christian morality. Whereas the modern story seems to be to do with the loss of meaning, the loss of orientation. And you could argue that that's a fairly typical contrast between the two, although we could do a bit more digging, and I may want to do a bit more digging on that in a moment. So to wrap things up a little bit here, if we're thinking about literary history, literary analysis, and the kinds of things we focus on, this is just my take. There are a number of people in our department who study literature, who teach literature, and who research literature, and we each focus on different things. We all share the belief that studying literature is just one of a number of different cultural products that's worth doing. We all do it in different ways. We're all interested in things. But these are just three broader points that I would want to draw your attention to. And these are the kinds of things I like talking about in my classes on literature. And the first one is gender, which is an ever more pressing preoccupation in our society today. So we say, and the father-son conflict is an archetypal conflict, but that kind of raises the issue, well, what about mother-daughter? Are there any texts, stories, dramas in which the mother-daughter relationship is thematized? And if we do have stories which focus on the mother-daughter relationship, do they work in a similar way? Likewise, we could expand the focus to think, well, does this work across the sexes too? I mean, what dramas, what are the consequences? What are the implications of stories which deal with fathers and daughters or mothers and sons? We could take this in a number of different ways. Another way in which we could take this or think about this is where is, in a society in which we're becoming more interested in gender identity as opposed to biological sex, what is the future of gender in the literary or the dramatic representations of the conflict between generations? So it might be, if we started, we look back into the Middle Ages, into the 13th century, we've got our kind of classic modern text, which is actually still quite patriarchal, early 20th century text. But if we were to look forward to the 21st century, is this kind of conflict going to be handled differently by modern authors? What is the future of this archetypal motif? We might want to ask, and it's something to look out for when we're reading really modern stuff. The second thing, and I've already touched upon this, is the contrast, the evident contrast between the pre-modern and the modern, which often looks as if it's the contrast between, with the pre-modern, confidence in meaning, the confidence in the ability to work out problems with reference to things that are larger than ourselves, and the modern, which particularly you know, when we start looking at authors like Kafka, which is to do with the absence of meaning or the questioning of meaning or the undermining of certainty. The only thing I would say about that is that actually, if we dig a little bit, here's where I come to my digging. If we dig a little bit and we think about what actually the moral of that medieval tale, the half a blanket, if we actually think about the moral of that a little bit more, treat your parents well, in that will give your children the example of how they're going to treat you. That's quite an egotistical. Well, actually, you could wonder, in fact, whether that that interpretation, that understanding of morality, isn't really an absolute one. That there's more to do with self-interest. So people are being encouraged to do the right thing, but out of self-interest. And you could ask whether that, in fact, is a bit of a contradiction. So it's perfectly possible to start digging with the pre-modern stuff too, and to find problems. Third point, meaning and context. When we compare, and this is actually building on a contrast between the pre-modern and the modern. On the one hand, you could say that so much of meaning in a text, in a drama, in any cultural artifact is context dependent. But one of the big differences we have between pre-modern stuff and modern stuff is that we have a lot of context for modern things, and we don't have much context for pre-modern things. And so on the one hand, you could say that makes the analysis of early stuff really rather difficult. We don't know who the author was of Half a Tale. We've absolutely no idea who wrote it, why they wrote it. We don't even know who they wrote it for. On the other hand, with Kafka, it's almost like we've got an incredible amount of additional information, additional data. We know, for example, that in a letter he wrote to one of his fiancées, Kafka said, "Das Urteil ist nicht zu klären." There's no understanding the judgment. So the author himself says. So with Kafka, we're in this curious position where we actually have a lot of context, but curiously, it doesn't help us. If anything, it makes us feel less certain than ever that we can actually find meaning in the text if the author can't himself. Conversely, there are different ways of understanding context. And if we were to take Half a Blanket and read around a little bit, it soon becomes apparent that there are a number of different versions of Half a Blanket. The version of Half a Blanket that I told you about is just one of 5, in fact. So one of the ways we can kind of construct a context for ourselves is by looking at the different versions and comparing the differences. And just on Half a Blanket, the version I talked about was called version A. If you look at version B, the narrator makes a point of saying how the child was inspired by God to say what he says to his father. So you could say perhaps there we've got a difference between something which is perhaps slightly more critical of the Christian framework, this idea that Christian morality is supported by self-interest on the one hand in version A, and on version B we've perhaps got a rather more optimistic or more convincing and convinced assertion of the value of Christian morality. I've said enough now on this. Thanks for your patience and attention.